If I visited a Shinto shrine, what would I see?
Walk down almost any street in almost any Japanese city or town and not many blocks along you will notice a simple, unobtrusive torii gate at street side. Turning to your right to look through the gate you will be surprised to see a small grove of trees in the midst of storefronts and houses. You know from the torii that a Shinto shrine is nearby, but no structure is immediately evident. You walk through the gate and perhaps up a small hill. And as the shrine comes into view amid the trees you will pass through another torii gate. At the end of the path stands a neighborhood shrine, consisting perhaps of only a single wooden structure. Standing several feet off the ground and too small for a person to enter is the residence of one of the local kami. On the front porch of the shrine, or perhaps alongside the tiny steps that lead up to the porch, there are several small white ceramic foxes, messengers of the deity Inari. Also on the porch just outside the shrine door are small offerings of various kinds, including a little wooden box for donations. Uncounted thousands of these unassuming shrines are quiet testimony to the presence of the divine powers. Larger shrines are naturally fewer in numbers but still abundant, preserving often relatively extensive tracts of forested land in burgs like Tokyo and Kyoto. The great shrines are all the more remarkable. Even in the heart of bustling Tokyo, for example, the high shrine still sits atop a surprisingly high and densely wooded knoll. As you pass under one and another monumental torii along the pathway to the center of shrines like Tokyo's splendid Meiji-Jinggu, you will find yourself slowing down and marveling at the beauty of ancient trees. The sheer power of place here is almost overwhelming, enveloping you with a profound sense of the sacred. At the heart of the place are worshippers, perhaps in large numbers depending on the day. Approaching the outer building of the sanctuary to pray and make their offerings. If your timing is right, you might witness formal ceremonies of blessing or priestly offering. Shinto shrines do not present the kind of public face that Japan's numerous Buddhist temples show. Shinto's miniature and not-so-miniature holy forests are vivid reminders of the need to acknowledge the sanctity of nature, especially when the hunger for expediency and immediate gratification compromises reflection.
Where and how do human beings have access to those truths?
Preeminently through the marvels of nature, including the human. Shinto's deities do not reveal a message otherwise inaccessible to mortals. As is the case in the Abrahamic faiths, for example. They do, however, disclose to anyone who reflects on his or her life with a clear mind and heart all the truth human beings need.
Have prophets played a role in Confucian tradition?
Confucian tradition developed in ways very different from the so-called prophetic or Abrahamic traditions. Confucius and his disciples never claimed to have received a revelation from above. They did not consider themselves privy to divine secrets. Their job was to call people back to social responsibility, however. And in that respect they share an important characteristic with the classical prophet figures of other traditions. Confucius also felt himself called to speak of justice to those in power. Much as Israel's prophets and Islam's prophet Muhammad challenged the rulers of their day. But on the whole, Confucian tradition and its literati were much too closely identified with imperial rule to function as effective critics of the system. Some scholars distinguish between prophets as seers, and people of action, like Confucius, as doers. One such Confucian seer came at a time when Confucianism was waning as the theory behind CIT. Liao Ping, 1852–1932 CE, considered himself and Confucius prophetic figures. As it turned out, he was a minor player. Known perhaps best of all for his lament over the demise of imperial Confucianism. Think of him as the exception that proves the rule.
Have women exercised leadership in Confucianism or CIT?
Confucian tradition is staunchly patriarchal. Long-standing practice all over Asia, as a result of Confucian influence, has until only recently expected women to obey father before marriage, husband during marriage, and oldest son when her husband dies. Education under classical Confucian direction was limited to males. That is no longer the case in societies that still acknowledge, however indirectly, their Confucian heritage. As for CIT, a number of empresses and princesses came to prominence over the centuries. But here too the leadership was male. Empresses were generally in charge of the so-called inner court. Empress mothers frequently had duties in matters of state and thus were often more active in the outside world. Women were never allowed in the main halls of the Forbidden City's outer court, except on the day a new empress married her emperor.
Is it appropriate to call Shinto a religious tradition?
Religious studies scholars have increasingly come to appreciate the genuinely religious qualities of Shinto. Every now and then criticism still surfaces that Shinto is so much a part of ordinary Japanese life that it is really a set of cultural beliefs and practices rather than a religious tradition. Some critics base their conclusion on polls of the Japanese public that seem to suggest widespread apathy about religious issues. Decreasing numbers of people are willing to identify themselves as adherents of any religious tradition, including Shinto. Other critics note that even Japanese who do consider themselves active participants in a Shinto-based community are likely to claim that they are Buddhist as well.
What is a Mandarin?
Mandarin comes from the Sanskrit term mantri, meaning minister or counselor. It became common especially after the 16th century, when Europeans came into more regular contact with Chinese culture. Europeans used the term to refer to China's social elite, so that Mandarin was in effect a synonym for literati. Technically, that meant all the bureaucrats who belonged to the 9 administrative ranks of imperial government or civil service. When the Italian Jesuit missionary Matteo Ricci, 1552–1610, determined to dedicate himself to working in China, he set out to steep himself in classical Confucian learning. An important feature of his reputation is that he was so successful that he virtually became a Mandarin. In popular usage, the term Mandarin has come to refer to Asian social and cultural elites and governmental administrators in general. Mandarin is also the name given to one of the most important and widely spoken of the many Chinese dialects.
Shouldn't a religious tradition be more invested in turning people's attention to a world beyond this one?
In fact, these and other distinctive aspects of Shinto are among its strengths and the basis for its unique contributions to our world. Shinto offers arresting insights into the inherent divine quality of the simplest things, of the beauty hidden away in life's nooks and crannies. Shinto tradition discerns innumerable causes for profound gratitude to the powers beyond the merely human that make life itself possible. Shinto may not be celebrated for producing sophisticated schools of theological speculation, but it undoubtedly possesses many characteristics that identify it as a religious tradition.
How do the sage, correlate, worthy one, scholar, and superior person differ?
The first 4 are all stages or levels in the Confucian hierarchy of human striving and perfectibility. They are the ranks of extraordinary individuals judged suitable for inclusion in the Confucian temple's various memorial halls. All 4 are, by definition, superior persons. At the pinnacle of the pyramid stands the sage, the Confucian analogy to the saint. Confucian tradition devised the various other terms, such as worthy one and correlate to describe the historical and spiritual proximity of famous scholars and sages to Confucius himself. In most Confucian temples, the ranks or levels in the tradition's memorial hierarchy are indicated by the relative placement of name tablets. Those closest to the master's tablet rank highest, and are generally called sages or correlates. Those in the rooms along the side of the temple compound are the far more numerous worthies and scholars. Scholars of sufficient prestige to have their names in the temple qualify as superior persons. But that designation is not used in the memorial rankings.
Is there such a thing as Shinto art or aesthetic?
Every 20 years, priests and specially skilled carpenters gather at the Grand Shrine at ISE for a ritual that says a lot about Shinto artistic sensibilities. They construct a new inner shrine on a plot left vacant for the previous 20 years. Then they dismantle the older shrine separated by only a small partition and leave its space empty until it is time to rebuild there. The carpenters use only the finest cypress, fashioned with the simplest of tools, and use no nails, adhesives, or artificially produced material of any kind. Each stroke of the plane or hammer is part of an ancient ritual that blends religious reverence and awe with the practical demands of sacred architecture. Each structure, however small and humble, is a work of sacred craftsmanship. During the Middle Ages, Shinto sculptors created anthropomorphic images of various kami, largely under the influence of Buddhism's rich iconography. Some sculptures remain important symbols in a few individual devotional cults within Shinto, such as Suno Ichijitsu, with its images of the kami's monkey messengers. But on the whole, modern Shinto worship is aniconic, focusing on the presence of symbolic objects, such as the mirror and sword, within the Holy of Holies. A unique and historically important art form is the so-called shrine mandala. Stylized depictions of individual shrines arrange the sacred site as a meditative device on a hanging scroll. Members of certain sects have used these mandalas as devotional focuses of esoteric contemplative rituals. Above all, shrines and their settings remain the most important visual expression of Shinto beliefs and values. Simple, natural beauty is the key.
Did Shinto tradition spread beyond Japan?
Shinto has gone as far as Japanese emigration and military expansion have carried that ancient tradition. You'll see the occasional Shinto shrine in various parts of the Pacific Basin even now. Reminders of a time when Japan projected its imperial presence beyond its shores, where Japanese communities have taken root and continue to grow, especially during the last 50 years or so. Older people especially take comfort in celebrating at the nearest shrine for festivals. But on the whole, Shinto has remained about as purely Japanese a phenomenon as one can imagine. Even in parts of the United States, for example, where now sizable communities of Japanese descent make their homes, traditional Shinto priests are exceedingly rare. Some suggest that Shinto anywhere but in Japan is a contradiction in terms. Shinto remains, ideally, a tradition inseparable from the very soil of Japan and its sacred streams, groves, and mountains.
How would you sum up the history of Shinto?
Beliefs now associated with the religious tradition called Shinto originated long before anyone ever referred to them as the way of the kami. Archaeological evidence points to various forms of nature worship, ancestor veneration, shamanistic rituals, and animistic beliefs in an agricultural society during the Neolithic, 7000 to 250 BCE, and Bronze Iron, 250 BCE 100 CE, ages. Primitive shrines dedicated to the community or clan. Deities called Ujigami appeared between 100 and 552 CE. Sometime in the later 6th century CE, after the arrival of Butsudo or the Way of the Buddha. Japanese distinguished indigenous beliefs from the imported tradition by inventing a name for it. During the Nara period, 710 to 94, the Nakatomi clan served as priests of a nascent imperial Shinto whose earliest major shrines were those of Ise and Izumo. By 737 Shinto shrines numbered over 3,000, 1 in 4 enjoying direct government support. The Fujiwara clan founded the important Kasuga shrine in Nara, the first capital. Kasuga was destined to play a critical role in the development of a hybrid of Buddhism and Shinto through its relationship with the nearby Buddhist temple of Todaiji. Throughout the Heian period, 794-1185, with the capital newly established at Kyoto, Shinto's fortunes were intimately bound up with developments in Buddhism. Theologians on both sides devised theories designed to fit the two belief systems together, thereby inventing dual Shinto, a blend of both. The Kamakura period, 1185 to 1333, witnessed the rise of feudal lords, daimyo, and a samurai warrior caste under a shogun. Throne field marshal, of the Minamoto family, which had toppled the Fujiwara clan. The samurai code, Bushido, was a blend of Confucian aristocratic conservatism, Buddhist mental discipline, and Shinto patriotism. Under the Minamoto the two chief kami were Sugawara Michizane, patron of literary and social concerns, and Hachiman, kami of war. Shinto grew as a popular religious tradition during the Muromachi/Ashikaga period. 1333 to 1568, the first name referring to the capital outside Kyoto and the second to the clan in power. With imperial patronage of pilgrimage to Ise Shrine. Pre- and early modern developments during the Momoyama/Azuchi, 1568 to 1615, and Edo/Tokugawa periods. 1615 to 1867, included Shinto's steady ascendancy over Buddhism and identification with the political power of dictatorial shoguns. 18th and 19th century Japanese isolationism went hand in hand with attempts to rid Shinto of foreign elements. That culminated in the Meiji Reform, ushering in the modern period. 1868 to 1945, and restoring the emperor to divine status. World War II called Shinto's imperial theology into question and saw a return of popular sectarian movements.
What are the main architectural and ritual elements of a major Shinto shrine?
At the heart of a major shrine is a complex of 3 units called the Hongwu. For a Jingwu, Hansha for a Jinjia. This central area, all oriented to the south as in Chinese sacred structures, houses the shrine's principal deity. Within the Hongwu are the Haiden, and Hondan arranged front to rear along the south-north-central axis. The outer and most public of the spaces is called the Haiden, or worship hall, where devotees gather individually or in small groups for special blessings and other rituals. Most people who come to the shrine without prior arrangements for special ceremonial ministrations from the priestly staff perform their brief prayers in front of the Haiden. But if the staff are performing rituals inside, those outside are welcome to observe. From that hall, worshippers can look across an interior courtyard to the central structure, the Haiden or offering hall, where only the priestly staff perform more sacred rituals. From there, in turn, the celebrants can see, sometimes across yet another courtyard, the Hondan, the Shinto equivalent of the Holy of Holies. There, behind closed doors and visible to no one, the kami reside. Also on the grounds of many large shrines one may find subordinate shrines called beku, which house related major deities. Masha house lesser deities. Some shrines also have small Buddhist temples, called Jingguji, shrine temples, on the property, remnants of the ancient connections between the two traditions.
Was Shinto associated with the samurai code?
Japan's fabled tradition of samurai warriors did have important connections with Shinto. But it did not arise out of Shinto alone or even primarily. Some credit a 17th-century Japanese Confucian scholar and military theorist named Yamaga-Soko (1622–1685) as the originator of the Way of the Warrior, Bushido. Yamaga emphasized the importance of sincerity and utter devotion to the ancestral kami as a sure road to experiencing the divine presence. Along with other thinkers of his time, he focused on the concept of Amaterasu as the ancestral kami of the imperial family. Total devotion to the ancestral kami therefore implied perfect allegiance to the person of the emperor, the shogun, and the territorial feudal lords called daimyo. Feudal society depended on the loyalty of its samurai, the knightly or military class. Even after the shogunate and the feudal system gave way to a rejuvenated imperial government under the Meiji Restoration, military supporters of the emperor turned the code of unquestioning dedication to good effect by underscoring the necessity of unstinting affection for the royal person and his household.
How important was the School of National Learning?
National learning, or Kokyugaku, had perhaps more to do with the modern understanding of Shinto than has any other movement within the tradition. Katen no Azumamaro, 1669–1736, is generally considered the founder of the school, insisting on the need to return to the earliest genuinely and purely Japanese sources. Among those he included the Kyojiki, but emphasized the Kojiki and Nihongi especially. Kumo no Mabuchi, 1697–1769. Continued what Kata had begun by applying philological methods to classical Japanese prayer and poetry. He considered spontaneity the native Japanese gift, without which nothing could be truly Japanese. Motori Norinaga, 1730–1801, continued the scholarly dynasty, and is still regarded by some as Shinto's best theological mind. His 44-volume commentary on the Kojiki remains a monument of scholarship. Hirata Itsutane, 1763–1843, was the latest and perhaps most influential exponent of the school, in that he implemented the thought of his predecessor Motori. Together these four men were largely responsible for the articulation of modern Shinto's highly nationalistic and ethnocentric tone.
Where do Shinto practitioners live today? Any estimates of numbers available?
By far the majority of people who identify themselves with Shinto tradition still live in Japan. There are also Shinto shrines in many areas of Asia, and a few elsewhere as well, in which significant Japanese communities have developed. Honolulu's Shinto shrine, for example, is a highly visible sign of a large and prosperous Japanese community there. Accurate statistics as to membership are hard to come by, largely because an increasing number of Japanese do not identify themselves as religious at all, even if they continue to engage in some traditional Shinto practices. We do, however, have fairly reliable information about numbers of shrines and active priests from which we have some idea of the tradition's vitality today. Some 20,000 priests serve between 80,000 and 100,000 shrines.
What are some of the main of Confucian and CIT officials or ritual specialists?
Strictly speaking, Confucians have no separate structure of ritual officials. Bureaucrats of the imperial administration were responsible for offerings performed in Confucian memorial halls. The emperor himself was the supreme ritual specialist in the sense that he exercised sole rights to perform certain ceremonies judged essential to the good order of life under heaven. All subordinate, regional, and local ceremonies were delegated to the various ranks of the literati. Today, Even in the absence of imperial structures, government officials still play that role. In imperial times, the emperor's administration was divided into 9 departments. Most important in this context was the Imperial Academy, whose chief officer was the Minister of Ceremonies. His function was similar to that of chief priest, since he was responsible for rituals performed in all imperial temples. A common ritual at local imperial altars required that a newly appointed local magistrate stay overnight before his official installation. In the temple of the spirit magistrate, a deity who was the earthly magistrate's celestial model.
What effect did the Japanese loss of World War II have on Shinto?
After the Emperor Meiji restored imperial power when the last of the great shoguns asked to be relieved of the burden of authority, loyalty to the emperor became a central theme. Prior to 1945, the vast majority of Japanese regarded the emperor, Hirohito, as infallible. Dedication to the imperial person and rule was perhaps the most important element in national unity. Admission of defeat in 1945 naturally struck at the heart of this central cultural institution. Since most people associated the emperor's divine descent with ancient Shinto tradition, the disastrous defeat called into question the viability of Shinto as a way of understanding the world and the place of the Japanese people within it. On December 15, 1945, the Supreme Commander of Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur, issued the Shinto Directive, dramatically altering the shape of Japan's indigenous religious tradition. Acknowledging the tremendous symbolic connection between Shinto and Japanese nationalism, the decree disestablished all shrines and declared them private institutions. Priests were no longer officials of the government. The directive replaced 3 earlier national structures: the National Association of Shrine Priests, Research Institute for Japanese Classics, and Supporters of the Grand Shrine, of ISE, with the Association of Shinto Shrines. It attempted to bring as many shrines as possible into a voluntary organization, whose purpose was to redefine Shinto as non-nationalistic religious tradition. Most shrines agreed to join, and most remain under local administration, entirely responsible for their own fundraising and upkeep. Long-standing tradition, however, does not yield so easily to the decrees of conquering foreigners. A number of major shrines, such as Yasukuni in Tokyo and others dedicated to Japan's war dead, still have the power to stir nationalist sentiment. Even now, politicians who want to play that card occasionally make highly publicized visits to Yasukuni.
Is there a Shinto creed?
Shinto beliefs, like those of Daoism and the Chinese community traditions, have never been reduced to a concise formal summary statement. If one were to produce a brief Shinto creedal affirmation, it might go something like this. I believe that sacredness surrounds me, that it pervades all things including my very self, and that the all-suffusing divine presence is ultimately benevolent and meant to assure well-being and happiness for all who acknowledge it and strive to live in harmony with it. Shortly after the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the imperial authorities formulated the rough equivalent of a brief creedal statement, called the Three Great Teachings, in an attempt to enhance the emperor's status. The three teachings included patriotism and respect for the kami, the establishment of heavenly principles in relation to human culture, and dedication to the emperor and his pronouncements. Authorities interpreted the creed in the context of worship of the sun goddess Amaterasu, and the other chief deities in the creation myth. Although it approximated a creed in some ways, this statement was more like an acknowledgement of the importance of underlying religious conviction for the good order of Japanese society.
Has Shinto ever been identified with any political regimes?
What came to be known in 1945 as state, Koka, Shinto began as a formal development after the Meiji Restoration in 1868. The term state Shinto was coined in the Shinto Directive of 1945 to distinguish formal Japanese government involvement in religious affairs from the religious concerns of Japanese generally, which were called sect, shuha, Shinto. After 1868, the Japanese government imposed a system of devotion to the emperor as a kind of state creed. Most Christians and Buddhists, as well as adherents of other traditions, considered themselves part of that system. Shrine Shinto was another term used to refer to the system. Since the government had instituted in 1868 an elaborate structure of ranks for administering the nation's shrines, government directives regulated everything in shrine life, including specific rituals to be performed and how records were to be kept. Underlying all this was the principle of worship government unity, Saisei Ichi. Directives also set up an elaborate hierarchy of the Shinto priesthood. One of the principal results of this extensive government control was the doctrine of absolute loyalty to the emperor and the expression of that loyalty in religious practice. A major symbol of the new way was the founding in 1869 of Tokyo's Yasukuni Shrine as a memorial to all war dead. As a way of controlling powerful symbolic expressions long connected with Shinto, the government decreed in 1884 that the torii gate could be used only for state shrines. In 1900, the government further ordered that shrine Shinto was no longer to be considered a religion as such, but a universally binding attitude of reverence for the emperor, complete with appropriate rituals. Another aspect of Shinto's relationship to the Japanese government is that long before the Meiji era, imperial palaces in the various capitals had maintained a system of 3 shrines within the compounds for exclusive use by the royal family. In the center, The Kashikodokuro enshrine the symbols of the emperor's divinity. The Koraiden, on the left, was dedicated to spirits of past emperors and their wives. And to the right the Shinden enshrined all the kami of heaven and earth. These shrines remain integral to imperial ritual today. State Shinto consisted of the approximately 100,000 shrines held under central control between 1868 and 1945, and the Shinto rites unique to the imperial household. Japan's post-war constitution guarantees freedom of religion and mandates strict separation of state and religious affairs.
Doesn't that suggests that Shinto is less than authentically religious? If it were, some argue, it hardly would tolerate multiple religious allegiances, would it?
Some point to Shinto's concern with the ordinary, the everyday. The natural world that surrounds us, and its lack of interest in transcendent mystery.
Have Shinto practitioners traditionally sent out missionaries to convert others?
Shinto has been so closely identified with Japanese culture as to be virtually inseparable from it. A desire to spread Shinto with missionary zeal would make about as much sense as wishing one could turn non-Japanese persons into Japanese. It is as unnecessary as it is impossible. Even the most devoted and active practitioners of Shinto do not generally feel themselves called to spread the tradition. At the heart of Shinto is a natural wisdom that cannot be taught or spread by decree. It is as natural as breathing. Of course everyone is better off breathing, but it's not something one can teach. Since the tradition is passed on organically, so to speak, and inherited as a family and national treasure. Practitioners do not think of it as something necessary for the betterment or salvation of humanity. At the same time, active members of local Shinto communities remain hospitable to a fault. Arrive at a shrine during a festival, and however much you may stand out from the crowd, chances are good that someone will invite you to participate in the celebration.
Are there any especially important Shinto holy places?
One of the most striking features of Shinto tradition is the intuition of the world's pervasive sacredness. Wherever the kami are, there is holiness, and that means just about everywhere people are willing to look carefully. Places where the kami dwell are called otabisho, stages on a journey, and are not necessarily identified with shrine buildings. Certain natural settings stand out as particularly potent. Mountains, waterfalls, caves, and trees have attracted Japan's spiritual athletes, ascetics, and pilgrims over the centuries. Mount Fuji remains a revered symbol of natural perfection and beauty. and pilgrims still consider a hike to the volcano's summit spiritually uplifting. On a clear winter's day you can occasionally glimpse Fuji's symmetrical slopes and snowy cap from taller buildings in Tokyo, 60 miles away. And it is easy to see how the mountain has assumed such symbolic importance. In addition to countless holy places left as close to their natural states as possible, sacred architecture marks many others as sacred. Founding stories, Enji, record how Shinto communities have chosen certain sites. These mythic tales tell how, for example, a deity went looking for a suitable dwelling and decided at last on one perfect spot. Amaterasu is said to have revealed in a dream to an imperial princess of old that she wanted her shrine built at Ise. Even into relatively recent times, Shinto tradition has considered such hierophanies sacred manifestations, important explanations as to why certain places are high on the ladder of sanctity and power. But Shinto has not been associated with holy cities as such, as have traditions like Hinduism and Islam, for example. Shinto tradition has not associated the kami so much with urban settings as with pristine nature. Some major shrines, like Kyoto's Heian-jinggu, have arisen conspicuously in the midst of bustling urban areas, showing a surprisingly public face. But most represent the cultivation of holy serenity in an increasingly disquieted world. Major publications list shrines according to their popularity and reputation for spiritual success stories. Rating shrines according to particular categories of greatest interest, such as healing, help on examinations, good starts in new businesses, and fertility.
Have relics been important in the Shinto tradition?
Sacred objects play a very important role in Shinto ritual. Every shrine houses some small token of the deity who graciously calls this humble place home for the benefit of worshippers who come to pay their respects. These objects, called Goshintai or revered kami body, are said to include such unremarkable items as a mirror, sword, comb, ball of iron, paintings, pebbles, or pieces of carefully cut paper. Worshippers generally do not get even a passing glimpse of the objects, for they remain always behind the innermost shrine's closed doors. People visit a shrine not so much because the sacred objects are there, as because the presence of the kami makes the place holy. When Christians or Buddhists, for example, make pilgrimage to a special church or stupa, they frequently do so because certain objects associated with a particular sacred person are enshrined there. They may not believe that the objects themselves contain miraculous powers, but it is the presence of the objects that makes the place worth visiting. Shinto's sacred objects play a very different role. Many worshippers may not even be aware of exactly what items a given shrine holds. In other words, the symbols of the kami are of secondary Importance from the perspective of Shinto worshippers.
What is the mandate of heaven?
Confucians have interpreted the concept of mandate or will of heaven in various ways over the centuries. As an ingredient in Confucian political thought, the concept has functioned both as a means of legitimation of the regime in power and a justification for overthrowing an unjust regime. The notion derives from a traditional Chinese belief in an elaborate network of correspondences among all levels of existence: the heavenly, the earthly, and the human. Human beings are not the independent source of authority. They can hope for harmony only through sensitivity to the ways of heaven above and of nature below. Order in society depends on the good faith effort of a single human being. The emperor as son of heaven, to rule unselfishly by always consulting the will of heaven. A theory of imminent retribution holds that there is a direct connection between natural and moral evil. In the world and heaven's displeasure with any emperor who arrogantly forgets the source of his authority. When the people prosper, one can conclude with certainty that affairs of state are in order. All as a direct result of the emperor's keeping his priorities straight. Many of the great Confucian thinkers have taught that the tradition's most consistent contribution to society has been that of fearlessly holding the ruler responsible to his people. If the one on the throne presides over an unjust regime, that person is no longer worthy of the name emperor. According to Meng Ziyi, for example, the people have the right to remove such a fraudulent leader. Meng Ziyi argued that violent overthrow of an unjust ruler was not regicide but tyrannicide. The greatest sovereign, therefore, is the one who governs only after first submitting to a higher authority.
What signs or symbols distinguish Shinto ritual specialists?
Shinto priests wear distinctive garb, called shozaku, modeled on courtly fashions from the Heian period, the days when Japan's capital was in Kyoto. Ritual robes are of several types. They wear a kimono and a kind of very full-cut pants underneath. Outer garments originally indicated courtly rank with various colors: robin's egg blue, red, purple, yellow, and light green, but now a priest's rank is indicated by either the pale blue, black, or red. Outer garments have very wide flowing sleeves and extend down to the feet. For ordinary ceremonies, priests wear a white silk vestment called a karanigo, hunting cloak from medieval times. With the simpler garments for ordinary duties, priests wear a plain roundish hat called eboshi, reserving the taller and more elegant kanmurai for special ceremonies. High-ranking priests wear polished wooden shoes for rituals, and their subordinates wear thong sandals of wood. During all ceremonies, officiants carry a slender, tapered slab of wood called the shaku in the right hand, similar to the one seen in images of Chinese ancestor figures. since even a layperson sometimes leads rituals and wears these same garments. They do not function like a habit to distinguish priests from laity. When not performing their shrine duties, Shinto priests wear ordinary street clothes. Shrine maidens, Miko, wear a white kimono top and a vermilion or scarlet split skirt. Only when they are performing shrine duties. Musicians, whether priests or not, also wear similar versions of heian court fashion during ceremonies.
Do Shinto practitioners mark sacred spaces with any distinctive signs and symbols?
Easily the most important symbol of Shinto sacred spaces is the torii gate, marking the entry and pathways to every shrine. Torii typically consist of a pair of unadorned upright columns and a pair of crossbeams, or lintels, at the top. The upper crossbeam generally sits directly atop the column and protrudes on both sides, while the lower beam either ends at the columns or goes through and protrudes. Some torii have more elaborate uprights and crossbeams. Depending on local and regional architectural styles. Devotees give torii as votive offerings to some shrines, lining pathways with hundreds of them inches apart, so that the entry to the shrine feels almost like a covered walkway. According to legend, the torii recalls the perch from which birds sang to entice the sun goddess from her cave. Most Shinto shrines use the simplest and most natural materials available, imitating nature as much as possible. Natural wood grains and the lovely green forest patina that eventually accents thatch or wood shingled roofs gives them a rustic character and charm. Many shrine roofs still display remnants of primitive architectural elements as a reminder of antiquity. Although newer building methods no longer require them. Many shrines retain a row of logs called katsuoji set along the ridge beam of the roof. Older structures needed the katsuoji to hold the thatch roof down. Another bit of architectural nostalgia are the vertical extensions of the eave beams above the roof line. As you view a shrine from either front or rear, you notice that the roof line forms an X. Horizontally trimmed upper ends of these beams, known as chiji, mark the shrines of female kami, and vertically trimmed ends those of male kami. Several rather mysterious symbols adorn holy places, whether or not the site has a structure on it. Thick straw ropes called shiminawa mark sacred places such as trees and rocks. Outer portals of shrines, whether actual buildings or miniature models used on home altars, also suspend shiminawa across their facades. Attached to the rope are pieces of white paper cut in zigzag fashion symbolizing offerings to the kami. The same bits of paper are attached to a ritual wand called the goe. Legend has it that the rope originated as a way of restraining the sun goddess from escaping back into her cave.
Is the term revelation useful in understanding Shinto tradition?
All religious traditions are oriented in varying degrees to two great inseparable realities: truth and power. Some, such as the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, tend to tilt slightly toward truths that human beings cannot discern without direct help from the source of truth itself. Others, such as Taoism, focus more on teaching believers how to discern and benefit from the well springs of power. Shinto is far more concerned with power than with truth. This is obviously an oversimplification. But what it means is that the power of the divine and its implications are the only important truths.
Has martyrdom ever been important in Confucian history?
Several Confucian literati have come to be known as martyrs. They died because those in power would not countenance their calls for greater justice in the imperial regime. One such figure was Yang Jisheng, 1516-55 CE. So strong was his conviction that the imperial system would respond to good faith Confucian criticism that he risked all to denounce a corrupt official at court. Yang meticulously crafted his case against Yen Sung and his son. Fasting for 3 days before presenting his charges, Yen Sung managed to poison the emperor's mind against Yang, implicating him falsely in a conspiracy. Yang languished in prison for 3 years while fellow literati attempted to defend him at court. All appeals lost, the heroic Yang refused to take a sedative before being tortured in prison. Before he was executed, he composed a short poem, in true literati style. In it he expressed the hope that he would live on in spirit. Still loyal to the emperor and grateful for his life of service. What is essential to note here is this martyr's dedication to advancing society through selfless commitment to justice in public administration, an outstanding feature of the Confucian spirituality of service.
Is there such a thing as a saint in Confucianism?
Confucius revered the ancient kings as sages, sheng, figures of towering intellect and virtue who represented an ideal never again to be attained by mere mortals. Their inimitability prevented the ancients from functioning as exemplars and restricted them to the role of venerable ancestors to whom all owed a debt of gratitude. Meng Zi began to modify the role of the sage. He suggested that the sage appears in every age, not only in the distant past. And he emphasized the sage's humanity and imitability. Individuals could aspire to and cultivate the qualities of the sage through education. With the Song dynasty came Neo-Confucianism and a further expansion of the sage's role. Building on the classic text called the Great Learning, De Shui, medieval scholars spoke of a series of stages through which an aspirant could advance toward the lofty goal of sagehood. Neo-Confucians identified the sage as the individual who had fully actualized all moral and intellectual potential and arrived at a state of oneness with the universe. Like the Daoist sage, as described in the Dao De Jing. The Confucian sage embodies perfect harmony with the cosmos. Unlike the Daoist sage, the Confucian puts wisdom's insights to work by active involvement in the ordinary affairs of society. A Confucian sage is like the Buddhist bodhisattva in that both are committed to the betterment of the human condition. The 10-stage bodhisattva career offers a general parallel to the Neo-Confucian system of steps toward sagehood. But whereas the bodhisattva has the power to reach down and change the plight of those who ask for help, the sage offers the hope of transformation through determination and effort. Sages model the best in Confucianism's spirituality of public service.
Do Shinto practitioners use special symbolism in personal or private rituals?
Many Japanese households have a special corner dedicated to the kami, a miniature shrine building. Kami dana, at which worshippers pray daily, is placed on a shelf or table. For special occasions they will go to the actual shrine. But everyday reverence to the kami happens at home. People can purchase these charming miniature shrines, some done up in exquisitely fine architectural detail, at religious goods stores in any Japanese city or at some of the larger shrines. Worshippers who get them from shrine shops often prefer to purchase them at shrines to which their families have ancestral connections. Priests often visit parishioners to dedicate their new home shrines, and sometimes make annual house visits for brief renewal ceremonies. People with more ample homes and yards might afford larger outdoor miniature shrines called yashikigami, kami of the home. Miniature shrines range from simple and affordable to finely wrought and costly. Business establishments, restaurants, police stations, and bridges on ocean-going ships, for example, might also have a kami dana to which the staff make daily offerings. Many miniature shrines have their own tiny torii gates and shiminawa. In addition, worshippers often bring small votive offerings when they visit local shrines. A popular offering is the miniature torii gate on which devotees write names and prayers of petition before hanging it on a rack along with hundreds of others like it at the shrine.
How are Confucian or CIT leaders chosen and given authority?
Priestly orders or classes in many traditions derive their authority from either hereditary lineage or from a perceived ability to manage spiritual power, or both of these. The case of the literati as a special class is quite different in many respects. Their role in imperial religious affairs may have originated with the office of royal astrologer, a person possessed of a special type of arcane knowledge. They had to understand all there was to know about how to plan Imperial matters in perfect coordination with the rhythms of the cosmos. But the literati's continued prestige rested on their identification with a broader range of knowledge, that of literature, history, and writing. Their privileged access to the canonical texts, the classics and books of Confucian tradition, gave them unquestioned authority. The literati oversaw virtually every detail of imperial ritual and administration, so much of which was highly ritualized, and were responsible for propriety and auspiciousness in all affairs of the state under heaven. They were, in effect, a kind of lay priesthood whose patron and model was Confucius. Prospective members of the literati underwent extensive education designed to imbue them with the classical texts. An exquisite sensitivity to the nuances of ritual, and an appreciation of the social and political implications of the relationships implied in the great rituals. Literati achieved their various ranks within the hierarchical structure on the basis of their achievement in the imperial examinations. From about the 7th century CE on, an elaborate system of examinations could give access to any of 3 degrees or ranks, each requiring as many as 10 different kinds of examination. The Board of Rites oversaw the examinations, and the Board of Civil Office made the final appointments. An important feature of this system was that, at least in theory, it bestowed authority on the basis of personal achievement rather than heredity or social status. The higher the rank of a local government's main official, the greater the prestige of its ancestral temple.
Do millennialism or messianism have a place in Shinto thinking?
Mainstream Shinto thought has not developed millennialist or messianic themes of any significance. Some recent sectarian movements, however, have centered around such notions. Events surrounding and in the aftermath of World War II, not surprisingly, raised questions of Japan's historical destiny for many Japanese. So-called new religions of Japan, many with roots deep in Shinto tradition, have been fertile soil for messianic expectations. One such organization is Ananaikyo, which teaches open relationships with and among the 5 Nai religious traditions: Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Daoism, and Confucianism. Various relatively recent Shinto-related cults and sects have centered around charismatic leaders whose teachings focus on preparation for an apocalyptic end of this world. For much of the 1990s, for example, members of a group called Aum Shinrikyo attempted to implement the doomsday doctrine of their leader, Shoko Asahara, conspiring to plant biological and chemical agents in Tokyo subways. They planned the final act of human history.
Are there any sub-communities or denominations within Shinto?
Numerous varieties and schools of Shinto have come and gone over the past 1300 years. Here briefly are a few of the more important, an ascetical mountain sect called Shugendo began as early as the Nara period, 710 to 794, and small groups remain active today. Beginning during the Middle Ages, several schools have arisen under the patronage of important members of powerful clans, now identified by the names of those families or of the school's individual founders. The larger groups are Urabe, also known by the later family name of Yashida, and Uiitsu Unification Shinto, Watarai, also called Ise Shinto, the Confucian-oriented school of Yoshikawa, and Kurozumaikyo, named after its 19th-century founder. Several other schools are identified by terms that suggest their principal teaching or emphases. For example, a 17th-century school called Suga, bestowal of blessings. Shinto laid groundwork for the growth of national learning. Suno Ichijutsu blended Shinto themes with esoteric teachings of Tendai Buddhism in the 17th century, focusing on the divine manifestation of a mountain king. Finally, Minkan Shinko is a general designation for a host of developments called folk religious beliefs and practices, incorporating elements of Shinto as well as other traditions. Japanese governments have promulgated various types of legislation, especially since the late 19th century, aimed at keeping track of the many religious groups that have occasionally leveled severe criticism at the imperial form of governance.
Are there any sub-communities or denominations within Shinto?
Numerous varieties and schools of Shinto have come and gone over the past 1300 years. Here briefly are a few of the more important, an ascetical mountain sect called Shugendo began as early as the Nara period, 710 to 794, and small groups remain active today. Beginning during the Middle Ages, several schools have arisen under the patronage of important members of powerful clans, now identified by the names of those families or of the school's individual founders. The larger groups are Urabe, also known by the later family name of Yashida, and Uiitsu Unification Shinto, Watarai, also called Ise Shinto, the Confucian-oriented school of Yoshikawa, and Kurozumaikyo, named after its 19th-century founder. Several other schools are identified by terms that suggest their principal teaching or emphases. For example, a 17th-century school called Suga, bestowal of blessings. Shinto laid groundwork for the growth of national learning. Suno Ichijutsu blended Shinto themes with esoteric teachings of Tendai Buddhism in the 17th century, focusing on the divine manifestation of a mountain king. Finally, Minkan Shinko is a general designation for a host of developments called folk religious beliefs and practices, incorporating elements of Shinto as well as other traditions. Japanese governments have promulgated various types of legislation, especially since the late 19th century, aimed at keeping track of the many religious groups that have occasionally leveled severe criticism at the imperial form of governance.
What is sectarian Shinto?
"13 principal sects comprise what is generally referred to as sectarian or sect, Kyoha, Shinto. Arising over the centuries and officially recognized in the early 20th century. The 13 cluster around 5 themes or emphases. First, 2 groups that emphasize purification are known as Misaji-kyo and Shinshu-kyo. Kyo means teaching or school. Fuzukyo, Jikokyo, and Onteikyo are called mountain sects because they centered around cults of 2 sacred mountains, Fuji and Onteik. They restructured along distinctively Shinto lines the teachings of several earlier ascetically oriented groups called Shugendo. 3 more recent sects have focused on faith healing. Kurozumai-kyo, Tenri-kyo, and Kanko-kyo all trace their origins to a founding figure. 2 sects called Shinto Shoseiha and Shinto Taisei-kyo have emphasized Confucian elements and have blended features of the purification and mountain sects as well. Finally, among the 13 are the most recent groups, whose mission has been to renew Shinto tradition. These are Izumo Oyashiro-kyo, Shinri-kyo, and Shinto Tai-kyo. The latter is an umbrella organization that was largely responsible for the official recognition of the 13. From these sects, dozens of smaller movements have arisen in recent times.
What is sectarian Shinto?
"13 principal sects comprise what is generally referred to as sectarian or sect, Kyoha, Shinto. Arising over the centuries and officially recognized in the early 20th century. The 13 cluster around 5 themes or emphases. First, 2 groups that emphasize purification are known as Misaji-kyo and Shinshu-kyo. Kyo means teaching or school. Fuzukyo, Jikokyo, and Onteikyo are called mountain sects because they centered around cults of 2 sacred mountains, Fuji and Onteik. They restructured along distinctively Shinto lines the teachings of several earlier ascetically oriented groups called Shugendo. 3 more recent sects have focused on faith healing. Kurozumai-kyo, Tenri-kyo, and Kanko-kyo all trace their origins to a founding figure. 2 sects called Shinto Shoseiha and Shinto Taisei-kyo have emphasized Confucian elements and have blended features of the purification and mountain sects as well. Finally, among the 13 are the most recent groups, whose mission has been to renew Shinto tradition. These are Izumo Oyashiro-kyo, Shinri-kyo, and Shinto Tai-kyo. The latter is an umbrella organization that was largely responsible for the official recognition of the 13. From these sects, dozens of smaller movements have arisen in recent times.
What gender-related issues are important for Shinto practitioners?
Shinto priests and priestesses have almost always been married people with families. Ongoing social taboo still prohibits menstruating women from participating as official ministers in ritual activities. Contemporary custom, however, has in all likelihood loosened such restrictions. It is safe to say that in general women have historically had greater direct participation in many Shinto shrine rituals than they do presently. Only unmarried young women are eligible for the office of Miko in shrines, and typically have access to the positions hereditarily, as a result of their family's priestly traditions.
What gender-related issues are important for Shinto practitioners?
Shinto priests and priestesses have almost always been married people with families. Ongoing social taboo still prohibits menstruating women from participating as official ministers in ritual activities. Contemporary custom, however, has in all likelihood loosened such restrictions. It is safe to say that in general women have historically had greater direct participation in many Shinto shrine rituals than they do presently. Only unmarried young women are eligible for the office of Miko in shrines, and typically have access to the positions hereditarily, as a result of their family's priestly traditions.
Have there ever been Shinto schisms or heresies?
Several of Japan's so-called new religions have developed out of mainstream Shinto within the past 2 centuries or so. Some traditional Japanese may be inclined to regard them with suspicion, possibly even labeling them as dangerous cults. Sociologically speaking, some of these groups qualify as schismatic, that is, splinter groups, in that they have deliberately parted company with ancient Shinto tradition. Some scholars suggest that Shinto authorities coined terms such as the Emperor's Way, Kodo, and the Kami-ordained way, Kanagara no Michi, to distinguish a type of Shinto orthodoxy from a host of less correct popular and folk beliefs. But since the concept of orthodoxy has been far less important for Shinto tradition than it has for, say, some Christian or Muslim communities, the notion of heresy is largely irrelevant here.
Have there ever been Shinto schisms or heresies?
Several of Japan's so-called new religions have developed out of mainstream Shinto within the past 2 centuries or so. Some traditional Japanese may be inclined to regard them with suspicion, possibly even labeling them as dangerous cults. Sociologically speaking, some of these groups qualify as schismatic, that is, Splinter groups. In that they have deliberately parted company with ancient Shinto tradition. Some scholars suggest that Shinto authorities coined terms such as the Emperor's Way, Kodo, and the Kami-ordained way, Kanagara no Michi, to distinguish a type of Shinto orthodoxy from a host of less correct popular and folk beliefs. But since the concept of orthodoxy has been far less important for Shinto tradition than it has for, say, some Christian or Muslim communities, the notion of heresy is largely irrelevant here.